This episode of the Paddock Pass podcast is brought to you by Fly Racing.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast presented by Fly Racing. On this week's show, we're going to be recapping the action from the Portimao Grand Prix. Steve English, Adam Wheeler and Neil Morrison on the show today. And Adam, this was another weekend where MotoGP just kept delivering.
Even though we had a double winner, Fabio Quartararo now 2 out of 3. He doubled up for the first time since 2020 when he shone at the beginning of that season in Jerez. There was still some kind of key crashes and moments, some good talking points coming up, and a few alarm bells going off, as well as some very emotional scenes, particularly in the HRC camp.
Yeah, and Neil, it was obviously very emotional for you as well. There was one day where the delivery was a little bit late for your food.
Exactly, yeah. The Portuguese Glovo man wasn't quite as rapid as my Barcelona one, but thankfully that was only one night, as you said, Steve, so everything was under control. But yeah, another, just, echoing what Adam said, I think the last time that we saw back-to-back winners was indeed Fabio last July, and there was a run of 14 races where we didn't have back-to-back winners. I think that's the longest sequence since 2002, 2003. So yeah, this felt like a little bit of finally someone putting their stamp on the series, because it had been so up and down for so long, and I think Fabio is showing us that he is possibly becoming the rider that we all thought he could be back in 2019.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens now when we go to the next round. Obviously, that's in Jerez, where he did the double last year, probably should have won in 2019 as well. So it's going to be tough for everyone now to try and get that little bit of a foothold into it. And I think that's what's going to be quite interesting now, because we saw Marc Marquez come back this weekend. We saw him get out on track. We saw what he looks like. We saw how much it meant to him, Ad. You were talking about that as well at the end of the day. But this was a weekend where there was all the question marks about Mark, and then suddenly we've started to get some answers. He started the weekend really strong, but as the weekend went on, it just got a little bit tougher for him all the way through. But to come away with a top 7 finish in this race after not sitting on a MotoGP bike for 9 months, never having ridden a race bike in Portimao, this was really impressive.
Can we just backtrack a little bit and, just revisit who said he was going to be on the podium or challenging for victory in last week's show? I think I mentioned he might be near the top 10 or just in the points. So I think I won that particular one.
I said he was going to be in the top 6, Ed. So, one place off.
I said he's Marc Marquez, lads, and I'm not ruling anything out. And I'll be honest, whenever I saw him in free practice 1, I was feeling a little bit smug, but that smugness went away pretty fast over the weekend.
I mean, P3 in that first session was pretty outstanding. I know it's mixed conditions, and Mark has shown himself to be a bit of a master in adapting very quickly to what he's facing on the motorcycle. But you'd have to say that first outing, that was when he was freshest. There was probably that initial glee of getting back on the race bike and being back in the pit box. Probably helped to help him. Well, help Mark push towards make that lap time. But all things considered, getting through a 25-lap Grand Prix, 20 of those laps, in pretty good form, it was pretty staggering.
Yeah, 273 days, I think it was, since Mark's last MotoGP race. And yeah, what you said, Ed, was impressive. And what really impressed me about it was any conversation I'd had about Mark's comeback prior to Portugal, basically centered around general theme of like, okay, yes, he has to be careful, but what if he finds himself in a battle with Joan Mir or Pecco Bagnaia or Franco Morbidelli or one of these new names coming through? Will he be able to control himself? And, control himself is pretty much what he did. He was actually just really mature about it and didn't, apart from the first few laps where he said he found himself a little bit out of place among the leading guys. He then got shuffled back and he had to take a bit of a deep breath. He was remarkably controlled, and he was just doing the mature thing of making sure he could get the maximum amount of points possible and not getting mixed up in any sort of silly running feuds in the race. So I think it was a really, really mature performance, obviously incredibly gutsy as well. And, hats off to him, because 7th place, 13 seconds off Fabio at what Fabio said was the most physical track on the calendar. I know it's another pretty impressive achievement from Mark.
There were still some Marquez hallmarks across the weekend. I mean, the front or rear slides on Saturday, during, I think it was FP4. It was pretty impressive stuff, again, using that word. But also in the race, he had a little bit of a run-in with Joan Mir. Was that rustiness, or was that Mark just being Mark in terms of, asserting a bit of, his position on the racetrack? I going into the Grand Prix, we had talked about him last week, and I said there were two questions for me. One, would he be able to last the distance? And I think that was kind of answered a little bit by his withering stamina towards the end, particularly with his right arm. And the second one is what would happen when he crashed, especially on that side of his body or anything to do with that side of his torso. We didn't get the answer to that one. Luckily, I mean, the last thing you want to do is wish an injury or a fall on him, especially at Portimao, where we saw some really fast offs throughout the Grand Prix. But, that's still one to handle. And considering it is Jerez next, the scene of the disaster 12 months ago, it's, another factor that could bother Mark all of 2 laps. I'll probably say, knowing him.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jerez obviously has the bad memories of last year, but Mark's fantastic at Jerez as well. He's got a lot of race wins there, a lot of good memories at Jerez as well. So last week on the pod, you were talking about how it would be really good if he, if Jerez was the actual comeback, because, for a storyline, it's good to have this, that, and the other. But I think it's also really good that he's had this race weekend to give himself the chance to get up to speed. And now he'll go to Jerez with his eye in. He'll go to Jerez understanding the bike. And, you'd expect to see him make progress now round on round. And the big thing with Mark is we know that once he gets to a certain level, Neil, that he's just going to be able to go out and win races on a trot. That's what he's done his whole career.
Yeah, exactly. I think he was basically trying to play down expectations all weekend long. And even after the race, he was sort of saying about how the doctors had advised him to really try and control his training. If he was going to compete, then he absolutely couldn't be doing any sort of riding away from the track. He could only do some gym work, which is basically cardio work, no work with weights. So he's basically having to give his upper body, I think, a complete rest between now and Jerez. And he was saying that that's another thing that he has to factor in, that okay, he's on the bike and in some cases he's looking like the old Mark, but he's not able to train with any kind of intensity. It might be, quite a bit of time until he's able to do that. So I think it's only natural that he's trying to play his hopes down. But if he's only 13 seconds behind the winner in his comeback race, you have to think that by the end of May, maybe even sooner, he's going to be fighting for the podium, maybe even more.
Yeah, and Adam, it's a bit like a footballer coming back from a knee injury. For every Ruud van Nistelrooy, there's a Michael Owen that loses their big advantage, loses the one thing that they had that the other players didn't have. Mark looks like he's come back, immediately has the same sort of feel and speed that you'd expect from him. And now we have to wait and see what happens whenever he clicks on the next round, and then when we go to Le Mans, and just how he builds on that. But it's going to be interesting.
I do wonder if I know it's the cliche is that they never look at it. And even Fabio was busting out this quote at the weekend saying he's going race by race and not looking at the standings. But at the moment, Mark's inhabiting 14th place in the World Championship. He's got 9 points and he's 52 down on Quartararo at the top. 52, that's more or less, it's 2 Grand Prix. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that he makes up that ground. Like you say, I think... Jerez as well as Le Mans and especially Catalonia. If he's firing 100% by the time we get to his home Grand Prix, then if I was the others, I would be looking over my shoulder. But I as I said at the beginning of the year, I still can't see him winning the World Championship. 14th
place in the championship, you say, Adam?
Yeah,
because 3 races into last year's MotoGP campaign, a certain Joan Mir was 14th in the championship. Spooky.
Well, it's only spooky if we get to the end of the season and Mark wins, Neil. This is just a coincidence right now at this point.
Well, the other thing is, I think Mark missed the podium only once, in 2019. So Joan has got quite some way to go before he reaches that level of results and performance. But it's a good stat, Neil.
Well, let's get into the race weekend as well now, guys. What was your big talking point from the weekend? What was the one thing that you were really interested in after Portimao, Neil?
I think my big talking point, or what I was most looking forward to seeing coming into Portimao, apart from Mark, was the performance of the Yamahas. And yeah, I think one of the takeaways has to be Fabio Quartararo's sensational performance right the way through the race weekend. It wasn't just, it was just fantastic. I think it showed, Fabio's development as a rider, his maturing as a rider as well. And I think it just showed that this year, the Yamaha is a pretty good package. They definitely have made a step forward. It wasn't just what we saw in Qatar. And Fabio, as you mentioned earlier, Steve, going into Jerez now, he's really got some wind in his sails and, is riding really well. So confident as well. So yeah, I think that's got to be my big talking point.
Yeah, and I think for me, Fabio was fantastic from when we went green light in FP1 all the way through to the checkered flag. The only problem was the celebration was a bit crap. But other than that, I thought it was a really positive weekend. Everything was exactly what you want from a factory rider. Ad, what about you? What was your big thing from the weekend?
First of all, Steve, I think he's got to, come up with his own celebrations, and then maybe like a footballer will copy him instead of like having to copy other sportsmen. Put your bar a bit higher, Fabio. There's no problem with that. Now he's looking, just going back to covering what Neil was saying. He's looking more mature, as you'd expect. He's only in his early 20s, 21 still, I think. That's still ridiculously young to be aiming for the peak of your sport. So I think, Yamaha have identified that. And already, even though 2020 was a pretty monumental collapse, you could say, in terms of his mentality and his approach to, grinding out the results or dealing with the fact that he was one of the protagonists in the class, he seems to be having a little bit more regularity and consistency, not just in terms of the results, but the way he's tackling a weekend compared to, say, Maverick Vinales. If I was Lynn Jarvis, I'd be looking at one side of the garage thinking, maybe I would expect this kind of approach to be the other way around. But no, it's like I say, it's good that Jerez is next for Quartararo, and then his home Grand Prix in Le Mans as well. He's fast at Barcelona. It's where he won his first Grand Prix in Moto2. So there's a run of 3 tracks here where he could really throw in some strong results and make a big statement for the championship. You criticize the celebration, Steve, but do you think it's is this Fabio's main kind of year? Is this his time, or is it still a little bit early for him to be throwing his hat in the ring?
Now's the time. He has to do it. He's the factory rider. He's into the stage now where he's got enough experience. He's obviously been fast right from the start in a MotoGP bike, and now he needs to be able to be consistent as well. Last year, won a lot of races, but from Catalonia onwards, it all went downhill very fast. He needs to show that he can do it week in, week out.
The reason I kind of say that is because one of my, not a big talking point, but observation from Portimao was a rider who I think we expected a lot of this year. And in our preview shows, we talked about what could he do, and that was Jack Miller. After the preseason tests, and we all kind of make the same folly of thinking, well, if a rider is shining brightly, in the first test of the year, and let's not forget, we used to go to Sepang, we used to go to Phillip Island. There was, different tracks, different kind of challenges, in terms of setting up the motorcycles, which teased us all into thinking this rider's got it nailed this year. If you had said after Qatar on those first 5 days that Jack Miller would come away with a ninth, and a DNF in the first 3 rounds, I think you'd think, well, has somebody hit him on one of those races, or has he had a technical problem? Because it would be pretty low key, wouldn't it? So for him to slide out of the race, they're battling for a top 5 position. He spoke quite eloquently afterwards about how he feels, to use his quote, that he's in the trenches. They need to work their way out of this hole. His confidence has already taken a battering. To see his teammate on the podium picking up silverware, it's really a tough time for Jack. And let's not forget his arm pump operation. So it's a big couple of weeks for him, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point as well, lad. Definitely for all of us. You base it a little bit on the results of pre-season, but you also based on what you see and what you hear and what the rider looks like. And Jack looks super relaxed. He was saying all the right things. But once you're in those trenches, suddenly it's not about having all saying the right things. It's about keeping the cool head and getting the most from the situation. We saw his teammate Pecco Bagnaia do that an awful lot better in the opening 3 races of the year. Pecco's been fast on a single lap. He's been fast in races. And for me, the big thing from this weekend, involved Pecco. It was the yellow flag incident in the qualifying session. That changed the whole complexion of the race weekend. And then you can also factor in Vinales into that account as well. It changed everything because suddenly someone like Pecco, who had the pace all weekend, would have started from pole position, was taken out of that battle for the lead. And then, Fabio was fantastic. But I really wanted to see what it would have been like in a battle up against Pecco.
You put it up there, the yellow flag incident. Is Freddie Spencer still on the FIM jury?
Yes, he's the chief steward.
I mean, you would think, having an ex-racer of that experience and caliber, they would... I know there's a letter of the law as such, but, there has to be some sort of interpretation, especially when the TV onboard images clearly show Bagnaia, as every rider is doing, looking towards the left of that turn, and the flag tower is on the right. Of course, in Portimao, we had the very first, emphatic use of electronic kind of yellow flags. Actually, was it in Brno as well? I think they tried that in 2020.
They had it in Le Mans. Because they're there for the endurance racing, obviously, with the 24-hour race. And I think that was about 2 years ago. And then the riders were saying that they had been pushing Dorna in the Safety Commission now for some time to introduce them just as an alternative to the flag marshal, just to give them, better visibility.
Well, it goes to show that the system's still not, nailed on perfect, is it? If, Bagnaia couldn't see that yellow flag, it was denied his pole position lap, which was frankly pretty damn astonishing, and then affected the race result.
Well, the one thing about that as well is the rule is the rule, and Pecco did break the rule, or, the rule affected Pecco in a certain way. Now, it doesn't matter about circumstances because the rule is very black and white. Now, do I think Pecco was at fault? Personally not, because he couldn't possibly have seen the yellow flag. It was on, as you said, at the opposite side. He's leaned off. We see that graphic that comes up all the time, 62, 63, 64 degrees of lean. They're going through one of the fastest corners on the calendar nearly. It's tremendous. You come down that hill, the bike's G'ing out. It's, really difficult for the riders. And he's off the side of the bike. He can't see what's happening on the opposite side. So, Pecco, I don't think did anything wrong, but the rule was broken. So I can understand why Pecco gets the penalty. For me, it was really unfortunate for Bagnaia because, it's such circumstances just working so much against him, just the absolute timing of it.
But the thing is, though, even if Pecco did see the yellow flag and and basically rolled out, I mean, his lap time would be cancelled anyway. That is the rule. If a yellow flag is shown, no matter what you do, your lap time is cancelled. So, the fact that he didn't see it, it's almost secondary, because even if he did see it and he rolled out, well, obviously he wouldn't have been as fast in that lap. But the lap time would have been cancelled whether he saw it and kept going as fast as he did, or if he didn't see it. So, that's one of the rules there, and it's tough. It does make qualifying a real lottery. I mean, Joan Mir was talking about, he obviously came through Q1 on Saturday, and he was talking about having to change his strategy completely because he only had one soft tire. Because he did Q1, he only had one soft tire left for Q2. And he said that they put it in at the start of the session just because there's that fear of the yellow flags being shown towards the end of the session. Someone gets a bit too excited, crashes out, then, you've got no chance of setting a lap time. I mean, it's there to increase safety, but at the same time, we're still having instances where riders are going flat out through a pretty dangerous section of the track where a rider is kind of stricken maybe in the gravel trap, or if not the rider, then the marshals are rescuing his bike. So it still hasn't quite addressed the glaring safety issue there, which is, riders have to slow down when there's a yellow flag there.
But it's a case where I think it was Miguel Oliveira was talking about the narrow optimum working temperature of the tyres. So if the guys are only going to get 2 laps and 2 attempts, I mean, Oliveira himself crashed out in Q2, pushing for a second fast lap. I mean, that was all he knew he had on the rubber. Maybe a revision of the rule would be to, exercise some judgment after the fact. If Pecco Bagnaia is charging on his fastest lap, and he knows he should slow for a yellow flag, I mean, he clearly hasn't seen it if he's still going for it. Maybe the juries can review the video footage afterwards and say, look, he could have seen the flag, but he decided to go for it anyway, or he clearly hasn't. And I think, the fact that Bagnaia is skirting the edge of disaster to make that lap happen, like you say, Neil, is a safety issue, as well as the fact that he could have slid off into the gravel, a la Tito Rabat, in Silverstone a couple of years ago. For me, it just feels too regimented. There should be a little bit more leeway.
Yeah, but that's also just where you're taking into account, whether or not you give Pecco a big fine for running through a yellow flag zone without slowing down, as opposed to, like Neil said, if there's a yellow flag in the sector, your lap's cancelled regardless. For me, it was just one of those things where this was just unfortunate that we ended up missing out on a rider being able to battle at the front. Now, it brings to light quite a lot of other potential circumstances and different things that can factor into it. But, I think that there's not really an awful lot that Pecco can complain about because of how the rules are written.
Do you think it should be, would a super pole for MotoGP be better?
I'm not a big fan. I'm not
Not for the spectacle.
No, I don't think so. We look at qualifying, and qualifying's fantastic. It's all action. Super pole is really good when you're looking back at superbikes from 20 years ago and you're looking back through rose-tinted glasses. Do you really want to sit there and watch a lap by, whoever's going to finish 15th in the qualifying session and seeing, oh yeah, they were, looking all right? The margins are so small in MotoGP now that you don't really know what's the big differences between those riders on any given lap as well. So I think the spectacle would be really bad. Now maybe you want to do it where you get a run out for the top 6 positions or something, but I don't know, qualifying works quite well. Even when you look at Formula 1 goes to the 3 sessions as well, and the most exciting minute of a Formula 1 weekend is the last minute of Q3 or Q2 to see who's able to get through.
I just think the 2 most dangerous parts of a Grand Prix weekend are that kind of 10-minute gap where, they have 2 laps, that's it, to make the perfect lap. And also the first couple of laps of a race, or the first lap of a race where everyone's bunched together. If you had, I agree with you completely, by the way, guys. As a spectacle, it's pretty gripping. But if you had each rider had a clear track to really bust it and go for it, then that's your safety issue solved in a moment.
Yeah, but then do you want to see a safety car start ad and a rolling start down to turn 1 as well?
Yeah, true. Yeah.
For me, it's those things where you're trying to balance it out. I'd quite like to see Marc Marquez on a quali tyre and seeing what he's like. But I also quite like that in Superbikes, we got rid of the Superpole session to give the riders a Q tyre, and it's up to them to decide when to use it. Maybe that's the solution for MotoGP. Maybe there is a Q tyre for Michelin that you can either use at the start of a session or you can use it at the end. You can use it in the middle. You can do whatever you want. And maybe that's what kind of finds a balancing point. But for me, the spectacle's so good at the minute, I can't imagine them looking to change it.
I'd love to see a 5-lap sprint. I think Dave Emmett's idea of that for Moto3 in particular is not too bad.
Hang on a second. No. You can't say that for safety reasons I'd like to see these kind of changes and then give them a 5-lap race to try and set the grid.
Why not? We're just spitballing here. We're, to use an American colloquialism. It's just we're talking. But in MXGP, for example, in motocross, the World Championship, the qualification races on the Saturday are there to give entertainment factor to the fans that are already in the track, and of course the TV broadcast. The riders don't particularly like it. Some do, the guys who are not the 1-lap specialists. But it's another start. It's another element of risk with 30 riders heading straight into the first turn. There's always an element of kind of peril there. So, in effect, a 20 Grand Prix season means 60 race starts for the MXGP guys. And, obviously in 2020 with the pandemic, that was scrapped in favor of qualification runs. And I have to admit that the qualification race missing there did remove a bit of drama from the Grand Prix on the Saturday. So, I don't know. Bring it in for Moto3, see what happens.
But it's also those things then where you're changing the fabric of what we've had for 70 years in the championships. And I think that's what can be quite dangerous. You look at superbikes, right? We've got the Superpole race. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the Superpole race for a few reasons. The big one is that it's counting towards stats. It's a 10-lap race. It shouldn't count towards your overall race stats. I'd love to see it where it was basically we had a Superpole session that set the grid for a Superpole race that then set the grid for 2 races on a Sunday. But that's because for me it would be the ideal solution. It kind of mixes and matches between what you're talking about there with MXGP ad, where you have a session that's going to dictate your gate position or your gate choice, and then it's up to you to be able to then use that to give yourself the best gate choice for the actual Grand Prix as well. But I think MotoGP, we've always had this kind of setup, and I think that if you start changing things just for let's get a little bit more spectacle, I think that's where it can get a little bit NASCAR-y, where NASCAR has the race split up into, I think it's 4 sections to give out points. So on the end of lap 68, if you're in the first position, you get X amount of points, which, it's all too gimmicky. Well, that brings us really to close about the qualifying session and what we saw during that. When we come back after the break, we'll talk about some of the other big talking points from the Portuguese Grand Prix.
Fly Racing introduces the new FL2 glove. With molded hard knuckle protection, this race-inspired glove is equipped with palm and gauntlet sliders and touchscreen compatible fingers. Available in 3 colors and sizes from small to XXX, the Fly Racing FL2 glove is the perfect answer at the perfect price. Check out flyracing.com to see more.
Welcome back to the Paddock Pass podcast presented by Fly Racing. Before the break, we were talking about some of the big instances that we saw in the qualifying session. One of the other instances was Maverick Vinales running out wide, having a lap time cancelled, and it took away another competitor that could potentially have been right up there at the front as well, Neil. You picked Fabio Quartararo's performance as your standout thing from the race weekend. But it was a race weekend where, missing out on those couple of challengers, it really would have been great to have seen a big battle like that at the front.
It would have been great, Steve, yeah, although I'm not sure we can count Maverick Vinales as someone that would have fought with Quartararo, even if he had been at the start, because his start was utterly shambolic. It was really quite desperate. Yes, he was 12th, but it still doesn't excuse him from entering the first corner, I think second last. And he said in the race that he didn't have the pace. He said apart from Q2, he didn't really have any grip or feel truly comfortable on the bike at any point during the weekend. So he wasn't pointing to Q2 as the moment that drastically changed it all. He said that, the race, he just had that age-old problem of a puzzling lack of grip that he wasn't really able to explain. Bagnaia definitely would have changed the shape of the race, though, if he was starting on pole, because you could probably bet that he would have led for quite a substantial period. And Oliveira, if circumstances were different, Oliveira clearly would have been in the run as well. But I think Fabio still was just was stronger than anyone, was stronger than everyone right the way through the weekend, from FP2 on Friday, right the way through to the race. Alex Rins gave it a real good go and went above and beyond his potential and his capabilities, and it told in the end. But I just thought Fabio was so impressive how he managed that gap with Rins, and you could just see it. He was just lowering his lap time every single lap in a bid to try and break Rins. And he was thinking the whole time. He was saying that he wasn't getting stressed. He was enjoying being out front. That he knew Rins didn't have this kind of pace or hadn't shown this kind of pace previously. So he thought, if I can just keep lowering my lap time, I'm either going to break him or he's going to make a mistake. And he said he saw his gap was at 0.2, 0.3, and he was thinking, flip, he's hanging on in there, fair play. But eventually Rins did make that mistake. And I just thought it was a really well managed race by Fabio. And he is operating on a completely different level this year, I think.
Yeah, I thought that this race was the best we've seen from Fabio in a lot of ways, just because he controlled it so well. Like you said there, Neil, he looked at a pit board that was constantly telling them a gap of 0.2. When you're at lap record pace and you're still seeing that you're not breaking away from the other guy, that's tough for a rider to deal with. And Fabio kept a cool head all the way through it. And in fairness, keeping a cool head hasn't always been his forte. It's clearly always been a little bit of a weakness for Vinales. It surprised me to look at the other side of the pit box and see someone that was, I think Vinales was 3rd or 4th fastest in FP4. And, then you hear him on Sunday talk about how much of a disaster the whole weekend was. Up until that point, I think you would have been shocked if you had said that Vinales was going to be running, the same pace as the likes of Bastianini in the second half of this race. And he was just, it just looked like another one of those cases where, the penalty in qualifying just snowballed all the way for him. Whereas for Quartararo, he just built momentum all the way through the weekend.
Yeah, for Vinales, Steve, I think it's a case of he was clearly rattled by that incident. I think it, sent a few shockwaves through the pit box, and it looked like it was still kind of reverberating, come Sunday. For Quartararo, I think, still, Steve, beg your pardon, Neil made a very sort of excellently detailed case for him. I still want to see, we've seen him as a race winner. We've seen him as an exciting rookie. We've seen him as a pace setter. But now I think we need to see if he's got championship material in him, and that will come up in the next couple of races because now he's at the top again. He had, his countryman there. I mean, Johan Zarco, I think, his kind of full-on face trackside when he had binned, the Pramac Ducati, I think was into 10, 14. No. That kind of expression was pretty, it said it all really. I mean, I think he knew he'd wasted a good opportunity. And now it's Fabio's turn again to lean everybody.
Yeah, it was another one of those races where you looked at it and you saw that, it just kind of went away from Zarco. Whereas Quartararo, Neil, he always looked like he was going to be in control of this one. He looked like up against Rins. Rins was having to be absolutely on the limit and a little bit more. I think this was one of those classic races where, David could legitimately say that someone was giving it their 110% because he was overriding the bike. And when he crashed, there was that almost sense of inevitability it was going to happen. And I'm not going to blame Rins at all for that crash because he's trying to win the Grand Prix and he's overriding what the package was capable of. And I thought that, he kept Fabio super honest all the way through this race.
Yeah, but to be honest, Steve, just to cut in, Neil, that was my other kind of moment of the Grand Prix because Rins has to be doing better. I know you admire him for going for the win and sticking out right on the limit. But, from that position, he needs to be doing better. I mean, we're talking about a rider who has not had more than 5 podiums in a season. He had his best year, last year when he finished third, and he only had 4 podium appearances. If he has he not learned anything from spending a whole year next to Joan Mir?
Yeah, he's learned that Joan Mir is the number 1 and Rins is the number 2 rider, and if he can win races, that's a good job for him.
He doesn't think that, Steve. He
mightn't think it, but over the course of a full season, I think that on the back of what we saw from Mir last year, I think everyone expects Mir to be able to grind out the results week in, week out. That's nothing against Rins. I think Rins is a super talent that on any given day is the best rider out there. But, how many of those given days do you get through the course of the season from him? Whereas from someone like Mir, he's never going to have those days on a Saturday, but on a Sunday, he grinds out results. This weekend, another example of it.
I agree totally with Adam there. With Rins not learning this lesson, it was great to see him up there fighting, and it was slightly unexpected because his pace was so much better in the race than it was in FP4, for example. But you look at Alex Rins, 2019 crashed out of the Dutch Grand Prix, crashed out of the lead, crashed out of second in the Sachsenring, which basically hampered his chances of finishing second in the championship that year. Last year, crashed out of the lead in the Austrian Grand Prix, crashed out of second, I think, when he was chasing down the leader at the French Grand Prix. Had he not crashed on both of those occasions and picked up, second or first positions, he would have won the championship. You don't always have to win it, not especially in the first part of the season, and especially when Fabio's been looking so strong all weekend long. There has to be a point where you think, okay, second place is a real good result here because Qatar wasn't a bad situation for me. You saw the approaches of Rins and Joan Mir contrasted very nicely because Mir clearly just accepted that it wasn't going to be his day and essentially settled mid-race for what was going to be maybe 4th or 5th position. Eventually came back quite strong. Rins just has those moments where it's like it's not quite a rush of blood, but you can't really count on him for just being there all the time. There are those crashes when he's fighting for top positions.
Yeah, but there's a big difference between the win bonus for or the bonus for a win rather than the bonus for a podium.
Steve, you're looking at the odds again, and you're thinking you're thinking about your bet for Jerez. And
I'll be honest, I had money on Fabio for this one. I didn't have money on Rins. I was glad when Rins crashed out and my bet was cashed out. But I think for me though, it was one of those ones where you look at how disastrous Portimao was for Suzuki last year. You look at this race as well. I can excuse this crash an awful lot easier than I can excuse a lot of other crashes that we've seen from Rins. When we were talking on Paddock Notes on Sunday night, I was saying that Rins is a rider that lives for today, whereas Mir lives for the championship. He looks at the full season. That's the difference between those two riders. Rins might well, snap out of it and realize that the championship is the bigger thing. But we also saw plenty of other riders in the past that took that approach as well. Like Casey Stoner always looked to win races and the championship would take care of itself. And I think Rins has that mentality. If he curbs that and he looks and says, you know what, I can settle for a good result today and then, I can push for these wins later in the year, that's the ideal solution. But I also think that he's a man under an awful lot of pressure because we know that Mir, week in, week out, will manage to just find a way to grind out results. And for Rins as well, he would have looked at it that Suzuki was his team after Viñales left. He's in charge of it. And then suddenly some young pup comes in that no one had heard of when Rins was making his debut for Suzuki. And suddenly he's the man that's winning the world championship. He's the man that's the focus of everyone's attention. And I think that's, a little bit of human nature coming out as well, probably for Rins.
Maybe it's a case, they both live in Andorra. If Rins goes round for a tea or something at Joan Mir's in multi-million euro pad that he's been able to build with his championship winning bonus, he might decide that a championship bonus is a little bit more beneficial than a race winning one. But another point, just talking about Suzuki, is we in a lot of our preview show material, we were talking about how the Japanese are maybe at a disadvantage of just having two bikes on the grid. You would have to argue that some of the inconsistencies seen in the other brands, Suzuki are actually looking in a fantastic position because, yes, Rins binned it, but he had potentially race-winning pace, and Joan Mir is starting to build that kind of consistency after his first podium of the year in Portugal. But look at Ducati. From Bagnaia's podium, you swing all the way back to Zarco crashing out and Jorge Martin apparently being the new second coming, and now he's in hospital again with 2 or 3 things needing to be fixed. Honda as well. For all the joy of Mark coming back, you had a big crash with Taka Nakagami. Paulo Spargaro had his confidence busted. Alex Marquez as well. Him and Zarco are now the most crashiest, is that a word? Rider of the year with 4 spills. I'm glad I've made it up. And, like KTM, Brad Binder saves the day for the Austrians once more. But then Iker Lecuona's something like 50 seconds away from the race winner. So the brands are all like having these wild swinging sort of set of fortunes for their riders, but Suzuki seems to be they're doing something right.
Yeah, well, Suzuki's got a really good package, and the team has been structured really well for so long. They got 2 very good riders, 2 riders that, like I said, on any given day, you're not surprised if either of them are battling it out for race wins, whereas there's inconsistencies elsewhere. And you mentioned it earlier on that, Jack Miller and that crash, that highlighted it as well. We came into the season, all of us expecting Miller was going to be really strong. We thought Qatar was going to give him a really strong foundation for the season. Instead, he's found the pressure just building. Now we're going to go to Jerez, and he needs a result in Jerez.
He needs a result in Jerez, yeah. And it was interesting that he was adamant that that the arm pump wasn't giving him any issues in Portugal. He obviously had an operation, I think, the Tuesday after the Doha GP to correct arm pump in his right arm. And he said that the 2 tracks that always give him the kind of the worst, basically the worst kind of issues with arm pump was Qatar and Jerez. So, with that in mind, you would say that, another tough weekend could be ahead for Miller. Historically, it hasn't always been great in MotoGP at Jerez. It's a tough one. I think we maybe talked about it after the Doha GP, but there's a whole variety of factors to consider. It's not just the fact that it's not been a great start to the season, but there is the fact that, maybe he isn't one of Gigi Dall'Igna's favorite riders in the kind of the whole Ducati setup. And also the fact that, there are other guys, Zarco and Bagnaia in particular, that you would maybe be looking at the championship and thinking that they are probably more likely to put together a decent season. So it's still very early days. We're only 3 races in, but Senna's in the trenches. I mean, it's a tough start, and he's come out of tough situations before, to be fair. But this is a huge test, a real big test now.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying there is dead on, Neil, because it is early days. We're reading an awful lot into only a handful of races where circumstances can work against you in different ways. And I think that's where it becomes so important these next few races, is to establish a foothold. Zarco did really well in Qatar, could have had a podium here as well. That builds pressure. And now Miller needs to punch back, answer back, see what he can do, because very quickly you start look to see what riders are available. You look at, Zarco obviously doing a great job in the Pramac. You look at Franco Morbidelli getting really annoyed at his situation at Petronas Yamaha. You look at riders coming up through Moto2. Maybe you're looking at just making a change. Ducati aren't afraid of making a change.
No, they're absolutely not. Yeah, and you look at even Moto2, Raul Fernandez, I mean, winning his 3rd Moto2 race. I think he's the first rider since Vinales to win, inside his first 3 Moto2 races. It's not regular that a rider can adapt to the category as quickly as Raul has. Will someone try and fast track him up to MotoGP next year? It's within the realms of possibility. It's a tough one. But then, Miller, after Jerez, there's a couple of races where you can see, or you should foresee him getting a bit of momentum going. He's always been fantastic at Le Mans. Mugello, we know how well the Ducatis run there. Barcelona is kind of the same. So, there's a couple of tracks after the Spanish Grand Prix coming up where, Jack can definitely get his season back on track. But, I mean, you have to say, at this early stage with Quartararo looking as strong as he does, and as Adam said, Miller now just with 18 points after 3 races. I mean, the championship is a long shot. Even a challenge for the championship seems a long shot at this stage.
But, we say we're only 3 rounds into the season, but that's already 75, points that have gone. And, Marc Marquez is 14th, just over 50 points away from the championship leader. But I literally just looked it up now while we're talking, and there's only 2 occasions since 2011 that the championship winner has had more than 75 points, advantage from the next closest rider. So it would indicate that, as we well know, that you cannot afford to throw away a single point in this thing, because it's going to come to a pretty tight finale.
Yeah, 25 points for a race win, and Quartararo's already given himself that sort of margin. And we always look at it that, it's very early in the season, but momentum comes early in the season. And you've got to make sure that in MotoGP, as it is right now, that you're able to strike when the iron's hot for you. Fabio's been able to do that. Some of the other riders haven't been able to do that. And now they need to make sure that they're able to just claw something back the next few rounds. And, we've already said Fabio is so strong at Jerez that that's going to be a real challenge for an awful lot of people. Neil, obviously, Adam has mentioned that one of his moments of the weekend was Alex Rins crashing out. We've talked about that. But what was your big moment of the weekend?
Steve, I think my moment of the weekend had to be just the opening 3 laps that we had, because it was fast and frenetic, but we also had Marc Marquez right in the middle of it. And, part of me quite enjoyed the fact that the new guys were showing no mercy. They really, Mir in particular, put a real move on him in the first lap, which was almost like retribution for what went on in qualifying on Saturday, which was kind of, quite juicy, quite spicy. And then, Mark just started, he was pretty loose, and he was saying himself after the race that he just was so out of practice riding in a big group of riders. He was getting dragged into the corners, and I think he nearly tagged me at the start of the second lap. I just thought that, I think it was David, our erstwhile or not our erstwhile, our good colleague David Emmett, saying that he was puzzled as to why none of the other riders had really tried to rough Mark up during free practice. But I think what we saw in the first couple of laps was exactly that. Everyone was basically trying to stamp their authority, just announcing to him, "Oi, this game's changed a little bit since you were last here." And, you know, fair play to Mark, because he caught his breath and eventually did a superb race. But I thought that first couple of laps was just stunning to watch, because it was almost like all these new young kids that have been performing so well in the last season were really, you know, jumping at the chance to try and put their mark on him.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the interesting things this weekend was Mark as well during the qualifying session. You mentioned it there, Neil. I just thought it was great to see him try and latch onto the back of Mir, and clearly just trying to do a little bit of bullying, you know, like what you'd expect Mark to do. He likes to get underneath people's skin. He's excellent at that. Tried to do it with Mir. Mir obviously bucked a little bit at that. But I thought what was even better was whenever he tried to do it to Rins then as well on the Q2 session, whenever he exits pit lane and there's just this standoff between the two of them to see who's going to gas it up once they exit pit lane. So I thought, like, for me, you know, those Mark moments were really interesting, because one is Mark trying to reassert himself in there, get underneath people's skin, and the other one is everyone trying to say, hang on a second, mate, you've been off this bike for a year, a lot's changed.
And it was interesting to watch the different reaction of the Suzuki riders. Rins, who has had this happen to him before, I think Brno 2019, where he eventually tried to, I think, run. He didn't want to run Mark into a wall, but he basically, I don't know if you remember, they were both entering pit lane together after Mark was messing around with Rins. And, Rins basically tried to shut his line off, and Mark was careering towards a wall before he eventually had to brake. Bit of chicken playing. But Rins in this instance was saying, this is just an aspect of the game that I have to learn, get a bit better at, and Mark's the master of this. Whereas Mir was coming out and saying he should have been penalised. This isn't on. I don't accept that. And I thought that was quite interesting. Mir obviously, I think, assumed the role of the world champion. Like, what are you doing to me? So that was good to see, because let's be honest, when Mark comes back and starts fighting right at the front, I think Mir mentally has what it takes to take him on. So this was, I think, the first of what will be many run-ins that the pair have.
The moment I kind of liked as well was Marquez crossing the finish line. I mean, you saw the bike wobble, he got unseated for a moment, and then there was almost you could see the body language and the sense of relief when he made the finish. And we're so accustomed to seeing him cross the finish line with some kind of celebration, some kind of, a gesture, some kind of display of supreme confidence. And to see a guy almost kind of limping home, was the most kind of, I think, stark reminder of where he's been and where he currently is.
Yeah, we're used to seeing those moments as Mark wins a race and he does something to mark that occasion. But this one kind of reminded me a little bit of when Rossi stopped doing all of his celebrations on the cool down lap. This was a moment where, Mark looked at it and realised, you know what? I'm just glad I'm back. I'm glad that I'm able to race this bike. I'm glad I'm able to be back there. And I think, Rossi faced that moment as well at one point in his career, whenever he then realised, you know what, actually, all this antics, I actually just love racing this bike.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't often see Mark emotional. I personally can only recall one time when he has kind of broken down in public and started crying, and that was after the back in 2015, was it, or the end of 14? Sorry, when he said he was going to move to Andorra, and he gave a bit of an emotional speech to the Spanish press at the Super Presidio, actually, saying that he felt some of the backlash that greeted that news was slightly unfair. And it wasn't just something that was for the cameras. I think he had a bit of a moment where he was very emotional in the garage afterwards. He had a moment when he was chatting to DAZN, the Spanish broadcaster. And then I think he was having some moments speaking to one or two members of the Honda setup. I think he was having some moments in private as well. And when you heard that, you thought, okay, he's put a real brave face on it, and has always appeared like the Mark of old when he's been speaking to us, but it really did remind you just the kind of dark periods that this guy's been going through. Like, he must have, for him to get so emotional, this was a massive, massive thing for him. And it just reminded you that he's probably been to hell over the last 9 months and back.
Steve, you mentioned his name a minute ago, and I'd like to sort of touch on, the circumstances around Valentino Rossi as our sort of winners and losers for this podcast. I think the situation with Valentino is not making for great reading, is it? A 12th, a 16th, and a DNF. I mean, he's got 4 points, so he's on the same as his brother, who's only done 3 races in MotoGP in not 2 decades. You try to think of something kind of positive to look at it. Like we said on the Paddock Notes on Sunday, he is coming up to Jerez on one of the tracks where he took, I think he won Jerez and then Catalonia in 2016, and then his last win was in Assen in 2017. So it feels like a long, long time ago. Rossi is at the moment making up the numbers, I'm sorry to say. I mean, he doesn't look anywhere near podium pace. And in terms of race wins, it's even more remote. So it's a little bit worrying, actually. I do wonder, even if a brand like Yamaha or somebody else would consider giving him a full factory bike if Raul Fernandez comes on the market or some other kind of rider from Moto2. What do you do?
I also agree with you, Adam. I think it's not just the results. I think there's a kind of, obviously no rider likes to go through these kind of periods where you're struggling to get in the top 10. Never mind if you're one of the, the greatest riders ever. But yeah, there's a kind of flatness to Rossi. There's a kind of impression you get when you're at his debriefs that he's just going through the motions. There's no real explanation offered up as to what is going wrong. There's no sort of detailed analysis as to what's going on. And you just wonder, he has said previously when he's gone through difficult spells afterwards that it's tough to find the motivation when you know that the best chance you get is going to be 10th, as opposed to first or second or maybe third. And it reminds me a lot of 2019 when he had that really bad run of results. He crashed out at Mugello. He was obviously taken out in Barcelona, crashed out at Assen, took out Taka Nakagami. Just bad. There was a really bad spell. And yeah, it's as bad as that period right now. And if it continues like this for the next couple of races, like you just have to say that this is it. I mean, what's the point? He's not enjoying it. Clearly, he's not enjoying it. And the results are nowhere near good enough.
Yeah, the problem for me is that when you look at Rossi, it's just so tight in MotoGP now that the margins are so small, and it basically means that when you're a little bit out, you're a lot out. And, that's what makes it really tough for Rossi, because he's looking at all the different things he can do to reinvent the wheel, and they're not making enough of a difference because the rest of the field is just that little bit of an edge on him. And, it's hard to see how it all kind of turns around for him. And I think that's what's going to make it probably a lot easier for him to make his decision whenever it comes down to it. Probably, the next month, he's going to have to make a decision because the Petronas Yamaha is clearly a good package, a good team, all these things, and they're going to want results. Franco's obviously looking like he's going to leave at the end of this season. He's talking more and more about being upset, all the things that are wrong with the situation. So suddenly Yamaha are looking at, maybe we need to just go and make this into the full junior team, look at 2 new riders to bring in.
Yeah, it's a good point, Steve. I think, maybe Petronas needs to go back to that role of bringing in the younger riders to develop. Maybe Morbidelli has moved up from being that kind of, he's not a learner anymore. He's one of the top riders in the class. And Rossi, that kind of retirement farewell. Yamaha have given him the best equipment to bow out of MotoGP. This could be the season to get it done. But on a happier note, I think my winner from the Grand Prix, I'll have to say Aprilia. Alessio Spargaro is now 6th in the championship. I think he said in his debrief that he has more points from the first 3 rounds than he managed all of last season. So, Aprilia, for all their limitations that we've spoken of before in terms of having the right riding personnel and the scope, and obviously the sad circumstances around Fausto Gracino, which was nice to see his memory honoured in Imola for the Formula One at the weekend. Aprilia have made a step up. And it's, Alessio Spargaro is one of those kind of very forthright and dedicated riders. You can never fault him for that, even if he doesn't bring the results on his CV or to the table. Props to the guys in black.
Neil, what about you? Who's your big winner of the weekend?
At the risk of repeating myself, I'm going to have to say Brad Binder. I think I'd give Brad the nod after the Doha GP, but that guy is doing some ridiculous things, going completely under the radar as well. You sort of don't really consider him among the challengers, and then wham bam, he's there on race day. It was a great performance from Binder. He didn't have a good Portuguese Grand Prix last year, but it was quiet all weekend. Qualified 15th, yet was 5th, 6 seconds off the winner. And this is again when the tire allocation had changed, and basically the front tire that the KTMs liked and used in last year's race wasn't in this year's tire allocation. And I think on Friday, Binder said the front tire felt like chewing gum. It was so soft. Obviously, those guys need a pretty rigid and a hard front tire. It's a bit like the Honda situation. What is that guy going to do when KTM finally have a front tire in the allocation that they find suitable to track conditions and track layout? Binder is riding really, really well at the moment. He should win races this year, no doubt. And in this form, he's going to be tough, man. He's just clawing out races. He's just a race day animal. Is Binder? It's kind of the old Moto 2 warrior that we saw.
Yeah, it is always fun when you watch the live timing and you see what Binder's doing, particularly in the second half of races. He just comes alive. He finds his way to the front of groups. He finds his way to find good pace. And I thought that, similar enough, like obviously Fabio Quartararo, we talked about him an awful lot. He's the big winner from this weekend. But for me, the other guy I really want to take note of is Enea Bastianini, because he was a lot like Binder and Pecco and Franco Morbidelli in the second half of that race. He got faster as the race wore on, and obviously his pace wasn't as fast as those other guys, but he was able to finish inside the top 10. The second half of the race, he was lapping the same kind of times as Maverick Vinales, and Vinales had all of his problems and this, that and the other. He's a factory Yamaha rider with tons of experience, and Bastianini was able to do something at a really difficult technical racetrack that matched the same times as Vinales. And also we saw that he was, half a second, 3/4 of a second a lap faster than his teammate Luca Marini in the second half of the race. This was a weekend where Marini was very strong, and Bestia did a great job in the second half of that race to set really fast lap times. So I want to just take note of just how good of a job he did. Adam, obviously when we have big winners, we have losers as well. Who are you going to pin that one on?
Oh, I mentioned Rossi already, Steve, so I'll hand it over to somebody else.
All right, you're bailing out on that one already. That's fair enough. Neil, what about you?
I think I would have to go with Maverick Vinales, just because it was lackluster in so many respects. It's just a desperate start. Obviously, massive slice of bad luck, just to be millimeters wide on the exit of turn 4 on his qualifying lap. Would have been on pole position if it wasn't for that, and then we might have been talking about a different situation. But it was a desperate race day. It was the return to the kind of old Maverick after the race, where he was complaining about the same old things, and then he seemed to make the mistake of looking at social media after his bad race, and there was a story floating around which comes from a completely unreliable source, someone that has proved himself to be very untrustworthy in the past. And
I didn't tweet it, Neil. I didn't tweet it.
But basically a story suggested that Maverick was going to quit MotoGP on the basis of what happened on Saturday. Now, as I said, this came from someone you would not trust at all. So Maverick then got into a bit of a Twitter spat and started responding and basically said, like, it's nice that, there's so many people out there that don't trust me and think that I would do something like this. And then he eventually deleted his Twitter account. So just a bad, 48 hours for Maverick, really quite bad. And, he did look like such a changed character in Qatar. The circumstances did seem to be so much better from this year, but after this weekend, it's just a case of, same old.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to argue with too much of that, and that's where it's going to be interesting to see how he bounces back over the next few rounds. I think for me, my loser from the weekend, we talked about Jack Miller earlier on, such a sense of expectation for what we thought Miller was going to be able to do during the course of these early rounds. Now that all the pressure's on him, I thought, we touched on Zarco as well. A mistake led to his crash. He was, at the end of the day, he's trying to push for his first Grand Prix victory or first MotoGP victory, but he needs to get results now. He needs to get a win. He needs to get that monkey off his back, particularly whenever he came here as the championship leader and, threw away good points during the course of this race. So I'm torn between either of those two for mine. Just to bring today's pod to a close, obviously we talked a little bit about it there, about during the course of the race weekend, we were offering our Patreon supporters the Paddock Note special. So for $10 a month, you're able to get an update each day of the Grand Prix from the the three of us and David as well. And it's basically to get you up to speed as quickly as possible. When the debriefs finish, we start recording and then we try and get that show out as quickly as we can, just so that you're able to get just a quick update over the course of the race weekend. And for a few of our Paddock insiders, just want to give a shout out to them. So Lou, Liana and Tej, some of our recent sign-ups on Patreon. Big thank you for the support you give the podcast. It really does make a big difference to us. We're also going to be able to produce a new show each Grand Prix weekend now. So we've got the Paddock Pass follow-up, and that'll be coming out tomorrow, where we'll recap the action from the Moto2 and Moto3 races, and also we'll talk a little bit about some of the other talking points from the Grand Prix weekend. So for myself, Steve English, from Adam Wheeler, from Neil Morrison, a big thank you for listening to today's podcast.
This episode of the Paddock Pass podcast was produced by Jensen Beeler, David Emmett, Steve English, Neil Morrison, and Adam Wheeler. It was edited by Brian Burnett. Music is provided by The Libertines. All inquiries can be sent via email to team@paddockpasspodcast.com.
Yeah, the problem for me is that MotoGP is just so tight at the minute that it's unlike...
Another guest on the pod.
Millie clearly not impressed by the Rossi bash.